All right. Hello, everyone. I see K Ghost 888 is there. Thank you for being here. Let me make this announcement over on my original channel. This stream was originally, let me adjust this a little bit. You guys can't see my t-shirt, but in its entirety there. This stream was originally going to be on my original channel, but I thought about it and I realized this is an entertainment. Well, this is a multi-layered topic, but it's rooted in the entertainment world. It's rooted in movies and cinema and comic books. And I thought this would be a fun opportunity to grow this channel a little bit more. This is my smallest channel, and it arguably doesn't get enough love. But so that's why I switched it from over there to over here. That's the main reason. Speaking of which, let me make another announcement over there to let folks know that I am live over here. I think folks saw the announcement, and then it was gone, and then it was an hour later. Okay. If you're just coming in, please feel free to shout yourselves out so I know who is here. I suspect this will be the largest crowd I've had over here because Dr. T is so popular. Okay, all right. Let me click that. All right, give that a like. All right, so I just shared my community tab there. So let me go back. And I will play the intro and then I will jump in. So I'm not keeping Dr. T waiting forever and ever. His time is very, very valuable. All right, so I'll play the intro. Uh-oh, let's see. I see a gold green McKinnis J100. Looks like we have a Michigan State person in here. Very funny. Okay, I'll see you on the other side. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Anwar Yusuf Dunbar, and this is Big Discussions 76, Entertainment and Media. First of all, please like the stream, please share it, and please subscribe if you haven't. I have a special guest today. I normally discuss my newsletter and my book project up front, but I'll save that to the end so as not to keep Dr. Johnson waiting. As I was watching that intro, it's time for me to update that. I saw I had a picture of Atlanta. So there's Donald Glover, Lakeith, I can't think of his last name, Zazie Beetz, and your boy who plays Paperboy. And as I was looking at that, I was thinking, okay, he was also in the Eternals. And I think me and Dr. Johnson are going to touch about that a little bit later in terms of how the images of Black men in media have evolved. Because if any of you saw the Eternals, well, I'll just say that his character Fastos was a lot different than Paperboy. Okay. If you know what I mean. I see Dr. Johnson back there smiling. I think, yeah, they portrayed him a lot different than Paperboy. I'll just leave that there. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Black Panther. We're going to talk about the Wakanda Forever trailer. A lot of people created content on that immediately after the trailer dropped. I waited a little while and I watched, and there were some parts of the discussions that spoke to me. I am Disappointed that Chadwick Boseman, he's passed away, but as I'll describe, I am disappointed that they did not recast the T'Challa character, and it seems like they permanently altered that world as we knew it. So we're going to get into that. But there's something I heard Dr. Johnson talk about, and I heard others talk about, which we're going to hit on later, and that's the importance of these characters, and this is the importance of reading and the importance of what these characters actually mean beyond going to the movies to see these productions. So there's a deeper significance for these characters and what they can do for particularly young boys, young Black boys, and that's something that I really wanted to flesh out in our discussion. Before I bring Dr. Johnson up, I have some bullet points here to kind of get the table set for him. So the first part is recalling the movie, recalling the first movie, the 2018 Black Panther movie, because a lot of people, that movie caused a huge stir. I mean, that movie was a really, really big deal. And there were people who really got into the craze and the mania of the movie. And then there were people who were looking and wondering, what's the big deal? Why is everyone going so crazy over this comic book movie? Okay. So I would say back in 2018, when Marvel and Disney dropped this movie, the Black Panther wasn't just a comic book movie. It was also a cultural experience for the entire race. And I'm sure I don't have to go into detail about this. All you had to do was just look around, look at the news, and see the people dressing up to go to the theater, the people, the excitement and the euphoria of that whole thing. So it drew in obviously the comic book fans, but it also drew in non-comic book fans as well. People who had never heard of the character, people who had never heard of Marvel, people who didn't even know that this was a part of a larger story and a larger web of events. So what do I mean by that? So if you looked on the news, you saw people going into the theater with drums. You saw people, there were even two guys who were dressed like Prince Hakeem and Simi from Coming to America. You saw people going into the movie theater wearing berets of all colors. You saw people going into the theater wearing dashikis. So it was a cultural experience. It wasn't just another movie in Marvel phases 1 and 2. The movie, interestingly, and I think we'll touch on this, the movie also sparked what I would call some reverse racism. What do I mean by that? Well, you heard stories of people, black moviegoers, telling white moviegoers, "You guys need to be quiet. This is our movie. This is our movie. This is our thing." You heard stories of that. So there was a bit of a reverse thing going on there. People had taken a lot of ownership over this movie. And I even got into the act a little bit myself. Someone asked me if I was going to dress up when I went to go see it, and I wore this kente cloth tie when I went to go to the movie. For me, it was another backstory and another character in the overarching Infinity War story arc. So that was what it was to me. I thought Marvel did a masterful job putting phases 1 and 2 together. And actually, I'm going to admit that I grew up as a DC guy, so Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. So I didn't really know who the Black Panther was until about 2012 or 2013, when a gentleman named Troy, who passed away, told me at our mentoring program they're making a Black Panther movie. And I was thinking, okay, Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, is that what you're talking about? He said, no. Black Panther is a superhero. He's a Marvel superhero. So I was like, okay. And so then I learned more about it as we got closer to the production and the release, and I saw Chadwick Boseman was the lead, and I saw the suit, and I said, okay, this is an actual character, and he's going to be in the MCU with Captain America and Iron Man and Thor. So this is going to be exciting. I thought that the introduction of the Black Panther into the world was the way they did it was masterful. They introduced him in Civil War. Okay. And I thought it was just very eloquent and beautiful the way they did it. You had your main characters, Cap, Iron Man, Black Widow, you had War Machine, you had Falcon, and then it was almost like playing with some toys. You know, you had your original set of toys, and then you're bringing in Black Panther and Spider-Man and Ant-Man, and Chadwick Boseman's T'Challa, his entrance into it was epic. His father had just been killed, okay, and then he went on his own hunt for the Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes. They introduced him in a very, very action-packed, suspenseful way. Bucky's running away, and all of a sudden you see this character jump down and topple him, and there's Chadwick I think it was Chadwick in the suit, and he's showing his claws, and then there was the chase down the tunnel. So that was very, very masterful the way they did that. The fight scene at the airport, he participated in that. And then just the way they wove his character into the entire web, I thought that was very, very masterful. So in terms of the movie itself, his first movie, his role in Civil War was very, very action-packed. Some would argue that the depiction in his movie, the original Black Panther movie, was a little bit different. Dr. Johnson might have something to say about that. But my impressions of the first movie are this, and we just watched it. I just watched it out in Phoenix last week with my brother, my best friend. And as I watched it, some things came to me. And this is what came to me. There were definite manhood messages in the first Black Panther movie. Father and son, king and prince. We have a male ruler of Wakanda, and then even towards the end of the movie, the queen, Shuri, Nakia, as they're going up to see the Jabari, they say, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to defeat Killmonger without the king, without T'Challa? What are we going to do without the king? So he was like the central character in there. So there was a definite manhood focus in that movie. There was the father-son dynamic. There was the ascension from prince to king. There was also dealing with the sins and the mistakes of the father in the previous generations. I'm almost done here. There was a battle between who would be king, Killmonger versus T'Challa. Once again, T'Challa was the savior of Wakanda. What are we going to do about how are we going to defeat Killmonger without the now king? And then finally, and I didn't realize this till the end of the movie, there were financial and political messages in the movie as well. So that was the whole piece about sharing the technology, sharing what Wakanda knows, and being a benefit to the lesser advantaged brown-skinned people around the world. And at the end, if you notice, T'Challa, it was T'Challa, they wrote it up this way. He said, well, I bought this entire block. I bought that building. I bought that building over there. I bought that building over there. And we're going to help uplift the people in this community and others. So those are my impressions of the first movie. We haven't seen the second movie. We've only seen the trailer, but it looks different than the first movie. So I'm going to bring Dr. Johnson up, and we're going to have a Q&A about why this character is important, why this all matters, and is this just a comic book movie? Why are people unhappy with the current trailer? Dr. Hasan Johnson, welcome.
Hey, appreciate it, man. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Well, good to be here.
Okay. Yeah, I thought about doing this after watching your discussion on it, and then there was the other gentleman who created his own comic books, and I thought it would be education is my wheelhouse, and just like you, so many other guys, comic books were my vehicle to reading. So I wanted to get your feedback on this whole thing.
Sure.
So I sent you some questions. So we'll just jump in right there, and we'll see where it goes.
Okay.
So you're well known in the YouTube streets, but for the people who don't know you, talk a little bit. Where are you from, and talk about your background.
Oh, okay. Well,
in as much detail as you want.
Okay. My father was actually a Black Panther, political, activist in the in the 70s. So right around the time I was conceived, the FBI were searching for him. So being in Southern California, we struck out to, live with his father, my grandfather, out in Brooklyn. So I was born in Brooklyn, New York. And, after a couple of years, my mother wanted to come home. So she moved back to Northern California with my grandparents. And then, I kind of grew up in the Bay Area, bounced around from San Jose to Santa Clara, that kind of thing, just in the Bay Area. Went to college in Los Angeles, Cal State Dominguez Hills. And went out to Philadelphia, did a degree at Temple for my master's, and took a couple of years off, got married and went to do my doctorate at Claremont Graduate University. And I am now associate professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State in the Africana Studies department. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And so Fresno, that's Northern California, right?
Fresno is central. So I am 3.5 hours away from Northern and 3.5 from Southern. So I'm right in the middle of the state. It is a farm area with desert temperatures. So 29 in the winter, 110 in the summer, and kind of remote from everywhere, landlocked, all that good stuff. So, yeah.
Okay. Before we move on, did your parents stress education, or were you kind of left to your own devices?
Yeah, it was a transitional time, especially for Black men and women. This was a time period where Black women are going to college in greater numbers. Black men are still navigating our work philosophy. because we come out of a context where my grandfathers, for example, that was the generation where they might have dropped out of third, fourth, fifth grade to work, you know what I mean, and help support the families. So they came out of that era. In the philosophy many Black men had was work as soon as possible. So you had some men that would finish high school, but many, due to financial need, might have had to drop out of school early and get jobs. And so my father kind of came out of that philosophy. He finished high school, but I mean, he came out of that philosophy of you got to work. My mother was at that time in the 70s, early 80s. She was transitioning more into higher education. She didn't get to finish her college degree until much later. I think she finished hers right around the time I finished high school. But she was, a strong advocate of higher education. So she kind of pressed that on my sister and I. That by the time you turn 17, you are going. She treated college like 13th grade. It's not an option. You mean you go from 11th to 12th. It's not an option. She treated college like it's not an option. And her philosophy was when you finished your bachelor's, then you were independent. You could make your own decisions about what you wanted to do, but you had to finish the bachelor's before you were considered an adult as far as she was concerned. So my sister and I are both professors, and that's kind of, what led to a lot of
that. Okay. And the school systems you came through, were they decent or were they?
They were public, but what my mother would do is she would have us live in like apartment complexes or we'd be on welfare, but we would do that in white areas, right? So I grew up around white and Asian kids, and it's Northern California, so you're going to get everything from Mexican to Samoan. But for the most part, she took us to middle class. It was like working to middle class white areas where we went to the public schools there. So the quality of the schools were a little better than, say, some Black areas. And that was why she did it. But she couldn't afford private schools. So we went, to those kind of spaces. And then, we went to state schools from there. So, I went to state schools for undergrad. I'm teaching at a state school because I wanted to find young men like myself who were kind of coming in there and needed somebody to help guide them through that process. But yeah, so that's kind of how we came through.
Okay. So right now, so you're at Fresno State, and you said Africana Studies.
Mm-hmm.
So describe Africana Studies, because I know you have an emphasis on the male side. What's that? Yeah, describe what you.
Well, that came about later, but I have several degrees in the field. So by the time I got to my undergrad, I met my mentor, who at the time was also the chair of the National Council for Black Studies. So, every field has its national organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you go into psychology, there's going to be a national organization for that. If you go into sociology, there's a national organization. And as a student in college, at some point, it's good to go to those conferences. And then if you become, a professor, if you become an academic, if you, anything like that, it's good to constantly go to those conferences to kind of get your updates on where the field is going. So my introduction to Africana Studies, which at one point was named Black Studies and evolved into a variety of different fields, Pan-African Studies, African American Studies, Afro-Caribbean Studies, there are all these kind of variations of it. But Africana Studies was kind of the branch I was brought through based on my mentor, William Little, who was chair of the department at Cal State Dominguez Hills when I was an undergrad. He brought me through the national organization. I was introduced to the field there, and then he helped facilitate me going to Temple University to do my master's. So I met a lot of people that are still in the field now. So if you watch, Greg Carr here on YouTube, he has a show that he does under I forget the brother's name whose show he kind of offshoots from. But there's a number of people I met at Temple that are still active in the field now. Matter of fact, we just had James Turner pass away, and he actually created the name Africana Studies. So that it evolves out of Black Studies. And the principal idea of Black Studies was that the university was going to be sort of a think tank that operated on behalf of the community, right? Because Black Studies is a product of student activism, right? What you had was Black folk who were going to colleges in larger numbers, but they weren't seeing faculty, staff, or students to any great degree that looked like them. and many of them pushed for faculty because they wanted to learn more about African history, about Black culture, especially going to these white universities. And so that's kind of where it comes about, that demand and that push and that activism from the 60s. And it eventually produced the first department at Cal State San Francisco. That was under Nathan Hare. And then it kind of grew from there. And you had Black studies kind of spreading, across the country in that regard. I would say most departments or most programs weren't funded very well. The university kind of did the base minimum. But regardless, scholars came out of that and pushed to develop the field and advance it. And, here we are. So it's still going. It's found new relevance whenever things socially take place, whether it's, the fight to, against apartheid in South Africa in the late 80s, or, stuff that went on with Michael Brown a number of years ago. And of course, in the last couple years. So those protest movements, those movements we hear about in the news, if you listen to the language, the rhetoric, if you listen to what people are saying, a lot of those come out of ideologies that were pushed out through Africana studies. So that's the kind of dynamic there. And Africana studies kind of set the framework. So when you got women's studies, Native American studies, Chicano Latino studies, Asian studies, all of those use the model, the archetype of Africana studies to, kind of come into its existence. But Africana was the first. And it wasn't a product of the university. It was a product of student demand. So it had a different tenor.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good segue. You just mentioned a bunch of different groups. I know you do work looking at genders. So correct me if I'm wrong. You described yourself as a Black masculinist?
Yes. I developed the concept of Black masculinism. And I'm one of the early proponents, along with Dr. Tommy Curry, in pushing the advancement of what we call Black male studies. So, we're really looking for a critical examination of Black male life that is empirically driven, because one of the things we notice about the humanities in particular is a lot of it really began to be shaped by concepts and ideas that weren't necessarily, verifiable. A lot of stereotypes, a lot of, assumptions about, a number of different things tend to lead the field. And so we represent a push, back to, I shouldn't say back to, but a push to move to a framework that's empirically driven, to make sense of reality in measurable ways. So Black male studies kind of kicks off with that. And if you start with Dr. Tommy Curry's book, The Man Not, that is, I would say, the principal introduction to the field of Black male studies. And so as a proponent of that, I've been developing concepts and ideas and really doing work around Black males across age, across class, across sexuality, across geography, across occupation, so on and so forth. Really looking at, the experiences of Black men and what are some of the areas that, need to really be explored. And really the other part of it is developing a vocabulary, not only for us to study the lives of Black men, but for Black men to be able to use that vocabulary to articulate themselves, articulate their experiences. And so that's kind of been, some of the push as far as that. But, you were asking about what Black masculinism is. I think you were headed toward that.
Yeah. So because I remember in the 90s, my brother went to college first. And I remember he enrolled in some women's studies. So, when I first heard you describe Black masculinism, I thought about feminism and womanism. And I don't know if we always had these categories.
These isms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I know you want to show me something. Is this kind of analogous to feminism and womanism, but for men?
I'll explain the context and then we can pull that up and I'll show you more about Black masculinism. But
sure,
the context really, when you start to talk about gender, formally speaking, most people consider gender having been introduced by feminism, right? And so one of the things you see when you talk about women's studies programs and gender studies, and these are really a product of feminist activism, right? Women's studies starts under that framework. And so, there was a critical, challenge to most fields around, issues of sexism, so on and so forth. Now, when it came to Black folk, you had a couple of different strains, and the two of the most dominant strains dealing with women and girls had to do with women, had to do with feminism and womanism. And they're not the same thing, or at least they didn't used to be. Black feminism kind of, you really have the kind of internalization of white feminist ideas applied in a Black context, right? And one of the overarching themes of that is a tension between men and women. When you look at white feminism in the white community, it was very much around accusations of sexism and patriarchy toward white men, right? And this kind of push for women to have access to the reins of power in the white community and in terms of Congress, in terms of political representation, in terms of the executive branch, the judicial branch of government, like this push to expand white women's options. And they began to try and reach out to women across race. And this is something we see in, what's referred to as the third wave of feminism in the late 70s and then early 1980s. So you had Black feminism, Native American feminism, Chicana Latina feminism, you had, lesbian feminism, you had all kinds of feminisms that really kind of came into, fruition. And in the Black community, that tension between men and women that was apparent in feminism in the white community was kind of transported here. And so Black men were talked about much the same way you heard white men talked about, as patriarchs, as abusive and oppressive, and so on and so forth. Womanism actually had its own strain. Womanism, wasn't so much rooted in the university. It was rooted in, unlettered Black women's experiences. And the idea was far more influenced by nationalism, Black nationalism. So what you would hear women say is, I'm not just a woman separate apart from my community. Women should be defined in the context of the lived experiences of their communities. So it shouldn't just be women as an isolated entity. It's women in relation to family as mothers, grandmothers, wives, daughters.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that framework, they argued that white feminism and Black feminism were disruptive to the Black community. And that at the end of the day, Black women were Black first, because, when you look at the history of Black America, you don't see Black women and white women living this existence of womanhood and shared sisterhood and whatnot. And so you had these tensions between Black feminism and womanism along those lines, where Black women were, Black women womanists were actively debating on a regular basis with Black feminists. And a lot of it came down to how you appropriate these white ideas and apply them in the Black community, and do they work? And womanists would often argue that it didn't. And so that's the kind of introductory framework for Black feminism and womanism. I developed Black masculinism because one of the things I noticed is that men were not, represented well in gender studies in general, heterosexual men. And then when you get to this whole question of gender studies, like if you and I were still in undergrad and I said, hey, check this out, man, there's a gender studies course, you should check out. What would your assumption be about the course? Who do you think it would be tailored to? Who do you think the subject matter would be fixated on?
I assume it would be women's studies.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's the problem. Academically, we've treated men and boys like they have no gender. You know what I mean? Gender studies is only for girls and women and LGBT, but heterosexual males are only entertained really as problems, right? They're the source of problems for others. And it kind of leaves us with the impression that there's nothing to be discussed. Now that's magnified that much more for Black males, because we come out of a unique history that separates us from white men in many ways. We have a whole different experience, and that's not represented even in Black gender studies context. So when I developed Black masculinism, it was along those lines. And so this is my blog, Black Masculinism and New Black Masculinities. You can find it at newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. It's, of course, a free blog. It's accessible. And if you click the About button, it'll take you here. And what I have here is kind of an explanation of what Black masculinism is. And it's basically, it's both a political and an intellectual and political movement, as well as an analytical / research tool that centers Black males across age, class, and sexuality, and seeks to frame the actual state of male life in measurable terms. Right. So we're using empiricism as it relates to history, sociology, so on and so forth, to understand Black male life. So instead of talking about Black men as abusers, as rapists, or whatever else, we talk about Black men in terms of what's empirically measurable. What are the rates of employment? What are the rates of intimate partner homicide, intimate partner abuse. What are the, these are the kind of things. And you can see I list some of them here, where I said advocating for Black male studies, right? So I'm saying it's, Black masculinism is a tool to be used in Black male studies. It is not synonymous with Black male studies. It is a research tool as far as academics are concerned. We endeavor to empirically contextualize the major pillars that indicate Black males' quality of life. So carceral treatment, criminal and civil sentencing, leading causes of death, health, employment, income, wealth status. We do these things and study this information empirically, because when you start to do that, and you would probably know this better than I would as a scientist, often you find what's empirically observable goes against common sense assumptions about what happens in life or what happens in general. You know what I mean? So people will casually say, well, Black fathers, and I grew up hearing this, Black fathers are the worst fathers. Black fathers are deadbeats. But when you actually look at the research, you look at the data around it, you look at what's been studied, you actually found a couple of years ago that Black fathers actually spent more time with their children, more time rearing their children than other groups of men. They were the most involved fathers. So we use empiricism to disrupt what we call common sense assumptions about Black men. And there's such a long legacy of stereotype about Black men that virtually goes back to slavery, that the waters are too muddied to base our understanding of Black male life on assumption. So that's why we push for this turn to empiricism, so we can actually measure this outside of the things that we've been taught to assume. So when you look at, further into it, I talk here about how Black masculinism doesn't presuppose or assume men's innocence or any kind of benevolent humanity in any given situation, but does seek to outline and highlight men's experiential narratives, ultimately highlighting men's humanity, whether inspirational or problematic. So I don't go into a situation looking to say that Black men are perfect, Black men are right. I just go into the situation to look at what the data says and what is measurable, so we can understand what Black men have been going through. And then here I even list, in the next paragraph, I kind of list some of the major theoretical concepts that Black male studies has kind of pushed for anyone who's interested. So we talk about white supremacy, we talk about the Black gynocracy in the Black community, we talk about the dual economy, outgroup male treatment, John Henryism, phallicism. These are concepts that are produced by Black male study scholars to better allow us to study Black male life. And this is, the case in any field. But what we find, when we try to study Black men, is that we often are using tools that were developed to deal with other demographics, and it doesn't allow us to get to the core of what Black men experience. So as with any field, you have to create the tools that best allow you to study the subject matter in question. And that's what we've done. So I use this page to kind of give people coming into it some direction on what concepts they can look up and kind of go from there. And then I created my show, The Onyx Report, here on YouTube, as a way of, really adapting the concepts to everyday, things going on in the news, so on and so forth, just to kind of give people a sense of what that's about. I also created the Institute for Black Male Studies, mainly because there is no department of Black male studies in the United States. There's only one in the world that's actually at a physical campus, and that's in Edinburgh in Scotland under Dr. Tommy Curry. So you have an African-American man, philosopher, who had to leave the United States and go to Scotland to teach Black male studies, mostly about Black American men. So there's such hostility for Black men, even academically, that he had to leave the country to do that. And my online institute is the only access to Black male studies outside of Dr. Curry's program or department at Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh. So, that's where things are with that.
Okay. And you have an online academy dedicated to Black male studies?
Dedicated to Black male studies. You can see it right here. You can go to instituteforblackmalestudies.com, and you can, find out more information about the field there. So there's some imagery, whatnot. There's merchandise, there's classes that you can take. There's webinars. I'm actually going to, ask Dr. Dunbar if I can interview him sometime soon. But if you go to the store, so those are a couple of classes there. Those some webinars you can check out. And then there's a number of free interviews. There's also an Institute for Black Male Studies YouTube page where a lot of these interviews are kept as well. And you can actually watch them for free and get a sense of what we're doing. So I generally interview, people who are doing specific work on, with and for Black males. And that's kind of what that is. So, professors, attorneys, artists, even YouTube personalities, if they're doing work on Black men, I try to interview them. And you can check that out. So the Institute is there for that reason.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Let's move on to the Black Panther.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my first question here, so the sequel, you mentioned that comic books were instrumental in your learning how to read. I mean, that's the same for me here. I have a bunch of books here. This was actually handed out at the fundraiser I went to, and I saw it the first time when I wore the tie. This was written by a guy named Jesse Holland. I never read this. Talk about the importance of comic books in your reading and education journey.
Oh man, well, if I could real quick, I'm looking in the comments, responding to Nerdy African. I'm not against Africa, so that probably disrupts your question. But as far as comics, look, I'm a geek. I grew up reading comics, and at the time, I'd never been to a comic book shop. I went to liquor stores where they might have one singular, like, rotating rack, and every week they would get in some comics, and if I was lucky, I had a few pennies to rub together. I would try to follow little collections here and there. But I've been reading comics now for probably over, I'd say, 42 years. Collecting comics, reading comics, DC comics, Marvel comics, independent comic books. And one of the things about it is it really did help with reading and comprehension at a young age, which was important, especially for boys. Now, I would say boys across race, and most particularly Black boys, because so much of education, is facilitated by women. I mean, at certain points, it's over 90%, female teachers, particularly in elementary and middle school. So you get to this point where dealing with students and trying to get young boys to read can be difficult if you don't have a structure that pertains to them. And there are virtually, no male teachers, depending on the level we're talking about. So often what I saw with my contemporaries, other Black boys, is they were either routed in and out of disciplinary hearings and being suspended and so on and so forth, always going to, some form of punishment, going through some form of punishment, or they were, kind of relegated to special ed. And that had little to do with their actual intelligence. It just had to do with they couldn't code switch. They didn't behave in a way that, teachers were comfortable with, most particularly white female teachers. So a lot of them would be routed into special ed. And, there's some term tracking implementations that come with that. So you're not necessarily college bound once you're put into that kind of framework. What often kept me out of those dynamics is because I had a love for reading, facilitated by really comic books. I was able to kind of participate in a way that, allowed me to stay in an educational track. And, and comics gave you a huge vocabulary. I mean, I was the only kid walking around class talking about a sanctum sanctorum, because that was one of the things I read about in comics. I mean, I was such a comic head that the lines between comics and reality, I didn't quite know. I mean, I remember taking a geography test in like 7th grade, and I remember I got it wrong. But, when they asked the biggest cities in America, I listed, among the cities I mentioned, I listed Gotham and Metropolis. I didn't know they weren't real because that's all I did was read comics, So, but it really ended up helping me kind of navigate education because I did have an appreciation for reading and critical thought that I would argue was really a product of comics, and I think that's something that really needs to be engaged, particularly with boys, because superheroes, action, we used to play different characters when we were during recess on the playground. I mean, it was a big part of our lives, cartoons, all of that kind of tied together. We learned about, honor. We learned about sacrifice. We learned about, how to stand up for what's right. All of these different principles that really came out of reading these superheroic figures who were going through their own heroes' journeys. And that had a lot to do with our own social formation as boys, when we were trying to conceptualize what manhood was about. That played a key role into it. So yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't know which universe you were into. Were you more a DC guy or were you more a Marvel guy?
Depended on when you caught me. When I was
Okay.
younger, I would say when I was under 7 or 8, I was more of a DC guy. When I discovered Marvel or rediscovered it, and I kind of got deep. Well, this is probably in this is the Mark Silvestri, Jim Lee era of comics. So I got deep into Marvel. I got into X-Men, Jay Lee's work on Namor. There was a couple of stories that really got me in. And then I ended up eventually, kind of balancing between Marvel and DC, especially by the time you get to books like Kingdom Come with DC, things like that. I learned to kind of appreciate it. But, when I was coming up, yeah, there it is. DC was kind of like the old man of comics. I mean, their characters have been around since the 40s. They were kind of the standard, and Marvel were kind of the rule breakers. Marvel was taking X-Men and making statements about race that ended up becoming applicable to LGBT and other areas later. But they were more willing to take chances. You know what I mean? But with DC, you could never quite, eliminate it, because one of my favorite comic book superhero movies to this day is Christopher Reeve as Superman. I mean, that performance was so brilliant, they still have to reference it every time they make a Superman movie. He is the benchmark in many respects. That first film, the first and second, with Christopher Reeve is still the benchmark of, comic book superheroes. So that said, I gained an appreciation for both. I wanted to create my own comic books. I was an artist. I initially went to college to be an art major,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to be a comic book artist. And so that was my first kind of desire in terms of higher education, was to do that. So I wanted to see, of course, I wanted to see more Black characters. I didn't like a lot of the Black characters in the mainstream Marvel and DC universes were sidekicks.
Stop. So you're talking about War Machine. You're talking about Falcon.
Oh,
right?
Yes. They defined themselves. Their whole characters were based off of white characters. They were based off of, Steve, as far as Captain America. You mentioned Tony, as far as Iron Man. Their characters were extensions of them. There wasn't always a clear narrative that showed that they were three-dimensional human beings. You know what I mean? They were just kind of these Black proxies of white characters. And there's a legacy of that in comics that goes back generations. You know what I mean? As far as Black comic book characters. And so, some of the early generations of Black comic readers ended up becoming comic book writers and artists, even within Marvel and DC, because they saw the potential for comic book heroes, but they really got tired of the sidekick business, and they wanted to, do at least one of two things. They wanted to create independent characters and stories that humanized Black men, particularly Black heroes. But then they also wanted to take the characters that had been around and make them into realistic beings, and I think that was the push of a lot of Black men going into the comic book industry. They saw the value of it, the potential of it. They saw what it did for boys, especially in school. They had experienced it themselves, but they wanted to actually make it more applicable, make it real. And so from there, you end up with a legacy of Black comic book characters that became more realistic, most particularly in the 90s and the 2000s.
Okay. All right. Well, it's funny. You said that War Machine was an extension of Iron Man and Falcon was an extension of Cap.
Mhm.
That's the one thing I got the sense of when they initially introduced Black Panther into the MCU, was that, okay, he's his own character.
Yes.
So were you familiar? My next question is: were you familiar with T'Challa and Black Panther in comic books before he hit the big screen?
Oh yeah, definitely. Let me say this real quick though. When you see Captain America: Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
and you remember when Steve and Tony were disagreeing about the Accords,
Mm-hmm.
right? Remember when Rhodey and Falcon,
Yep. Sam
they're
Wilson.
debating, but they're extensions of Tony and Steve. So Tony and Steve are sitting in the room quietly at a certain point, and Rhodey and Falcon are arguing just like they're Tony and Steve. Like there's virtually no separation between them and their benefactors. You know what I mean? That legacy of being, sidekicks is still apparent, and that's what made Panther so important. You didn't see him as a sidekick to anybody. He had his own opinion. He had his own context. He came out of his own particular history. He was independent of that legacy. Now, Panther himself was written and created by white men at Marvel Comics, but you had again generations of black writers and artists who sought to make the character applicable to Black America. And I remember that push. Well, I should say there's various waves of it, but it's even in the 90s. I remember that push to make him applicable, make him to tie him to the Black communal experience, that whole kind of thing. And that was important to a lot of us comic lovers who just didn't see ourselves in the books. We wanted stories that made sense, stories that came out of our own experiences, especially if you were going to have black characters. And so instead of black characters written by whites and what they assumed blackness was about, you finally got to see stories written by black folk, and even penned by black folk, as far as the artwork is concerned, to make those characters tie more realistically to the black community. And that's still an issue. That's still an issue to this day. Just this year, they took a character named Miles Morales, who's kind of a new Spider-Man that came about in the last number of years. And for one or so comics, they asked a what if. It was a what if comic, and they made him Thor. And the writer of that series was not black, and the story got panned because there was so much stereotypes, so many assumptions about black men that don't come out of the black community itself, that were just kind of thrown onto the character, that it was just virtually offensive for a lot of people. So these issues are still going on, and it still happens in television and in film, where you have whites and others that want to write black people as walking stereotypes. And so that's still an ongoing fight, and that fight has been going on in comics for generations. But but I did read Panther coming up, and Panther's important. He was the first major mainstream hero of African descent that we got to see, who wasn't a sidekick. He had his own book. He was his own character. He was a monarch. You know what I mean? His contemporaries were like Dr. Doom and Namor. They had their own kingdoms that they were running. We'd never seen that. He had his own kingdom, the most technologically advanced, country in the world, in the middle of Africa, that nobody knew about. That's a huge, kind of framework to build a story off of. And then two, he came from a legacy of powerful black male kings. So these characters were initially targeted at African American readers. And, the comic book industry for generations was really targeted more at boys. So you're talking about a character that was being designed to cater to black boys. And we got to see things that black boys never got to see. A strong male who was actually in a position of leadership. One of his most significant superpowers is he was one of the top 10 intellects on the planet. And he was deeply immersed into science and technology. He created his own branch of physics in the comic books. When's the last time you saw a superhero do that? He inspired black boys to ask questions about science, to actually inquire about going into STEM before, I remember before it was popularly called STEM. But it was one of those things that the character, excited in young black boys. So it became very important. Yeah. So T'Challa, culturally speaking, was significant, even though he wasn't created by black comic book insiders. They kind of appropriated him at a certain point because of the importance to boys.
Yeah. So I want to point out in this discussion about the trailer, Dr. Watkins, I'll call him Dr. Watkins. One of the things he pointed out was that we did not create the character. The creator was created by Stan Lee, and now Marvel owns the cinematic rights to the character, so they can take the character and do pretty much whatever they want to do with the character in his world. Right. Which brings me to my next question, which was, what was your reaction? I didn't read the comic book, so based upon what you just said, I do know that his intellectual attributes, those were kind of reassigned to Letitia Wright's Shuri.
Yeah. And you're taking us to the first movie. First, let me put it in context. So this is a character created in 1966. He predates many of the significant black characters. That he wasn't the first black character in a comic book, he was the first major mainstream hero that was of African descent, and he predated many of the others that would come later, from Blade, to I mean, you name it. A number of the various other characters, Falcon, even Luke Cage, John Stewart, he predated them, right? So that's important. But we never had a live action film. So again, I'm a 42-year comic book reader. This character was created in 1966. I've seen so many different, Marvel and DC TV shows and movies. I heard whispers in the 1990s about a possible Black Panther film under Wesley Snipes, but they never could bring it to the screen. That's why he ended up doing Blade. And he did a fantastic job with Blade. Blade was a C-level character that nobody cared about until Wesley made him relevant with just pure swag, But we always wanted to see Panther. We wanted to see a monarch. We wanted to see a high-level technological. Man, truthfully speaking, the movie probably couldn't have been made well in the 90s because they didn't even have the graphics technology to make it look the way it needed to. But still, we've seen a lot of different variations of stories told in film that, before the era of advanced graphics. So there could have been something, but we never got to see it. So the first time we get Panther on the screen as a live action character is only about 4 years ago. You know what I mean? If you look at 1966 to 2018, that's how long we didn't get to see a comic book character we've been reading about for decades. And the very first time we finally get to see him on the screen, his greatest superpower is given to his little sister, a character that didn't even exist until just a number of years before the film came out.
Wow. Right? Oh, really? So Shuri doesn't go back 20 to 30 years?
No.
Wow.
No. She doesn't. She was created fairly late. And I think this is an era, and understandably, I get it, where you have comic book companies that are trying to expand their base, right? And they're trying to, reach into different populations. So they're trying to appeal to women, they're trying to appeal to girls. I mean, and movies are also still about, even to this day, they're still about selling toys. So they're trying to, expand the market base on who they sell to. So, by the time they created Shuri, I understood it. I wasn't surprised that she was in the film. I didn't have a problem with that. But I would have rather liked to see the Shuri from the comics. But when you give, I would argue, his most significant superpower to his little sister, it radically changes the character. I mean, it's like going to see Superman, but Lois has his super strength. Right? Is that a Superman movie? So one could argue we actually never got a Panther movie based on the Panther we've been reading about. I've still not seen the brilliance in T'Challa that I read about as a kid.
Wow.
And wanted to see. So, and again, this is a character that was an inspiration to generations of Black boys and gave them possibilities of what they could be. So the very first time after all these years, we finally get a live action movie. He's neutered in terms of his most significant superpower, and his sister has it, right? And you mentioned the trailer for the second film, Black Panther Wakanda Forever.
So, Dr. Johnson, before you go on, so is that the reason the movie was such a big deal? The 2018 movie was the fact that it was the first live action depiction of him.
Yes.
For across the board.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And I would argue, even again, it was a fairly late edition. I think taking place in the late 90s was the bringing in of the Dora Milaje, which is kind of based off the Dahomey Amazons, which they're kind of colloquially referred to. They were, so you had this all-female military kind of force, but they weren't military. They were more like the president of the United States security team for T'Challa, for the Black Panther. So they were kind of like his security team. And technically there was some talk about them actually being wives, but we're in an era where feminism is kind of a standard. So that was always kind of kept kind of low key because they didn't want to offend people, but they were kind of his wives / security team. By the time you get to the first movie, they're like their own military and whatnot, but that wasn't initially the case. But yeah, it was. So, you get to 2018, they're first creating this character. It's important because none of us have seen it on screen. They're appealing to women. They're appealing to LGBTs in ways that we hadn't seen. I mean, I never imagined seeing so many different demographics in the Black community excited about the Panther, because that's just not, how the comics were written. And it's not a bad thing in and of itself, because the MCU was trying to do this across the board in its first couple phases, where they were really trying to tap into these different demographics and open up sales. And they were successful, I would argue, in doing so. So the first Panther, you had, men and women, girls and boys dressing up in all kinds of different outfits. You said you wore the kente neck, tie.
Mm-hmm.
My son actually got me the silver panther claw necklace, and so he wore a t-shirt. I wore that. We went to go see it together. And there were a number of different kinds of disappointments, that I experienced as a longtime comic reader, because they weren't trying to cater to the comic readers. They were trying to cater to new generations, but they did so in a way that didn't respect the legacy of the comics and what made the character who he was. But we at least got to see Panther on screen for the first time. Very different thing than what seems to be coming in the sequel.
Okay. Yeah, and then again, in this iteration, he was more of just an action. His fighting, his battles with what's his name? Winston Duke's character. I can't think of his name.
M'Baku.
M'Baku, yeah, M'Baku and Killmonger. That was his strength.
Mm.
His athleticism, his fighting.
Athleticism, fighting, but so he takes the heart-shaped herb. He has Captain America-esque level superpowers, hyper physicality, but still within the realm of human possibility. Like they always used to describe Cap as being like a high-level Olympian athlete.
Mm-hmm.
So Panther, who actually would beat Captain America every time they would fight,
really,
he would beat Captain America, which was a big deal to us. It was like, because we, that wasn't something we saw in the 60s and 70s, but you did see it in the 90s and the 2000s. So he was peak level, just above Cap in that respect, right? But that's not what made him so great. What made him great is he was absolutely brilliant. He was just a strategic genius. You know what I mean? That was the thing that really set him apart. He would invent things. He would create new technology. Every time you'd see him in a comic, he'd be walking around with something brand new that he just built. And you're just like, wow, because this was something you only got to see with people like Tony Stark or, Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, where they're creating all kinds of new technology. Then all of a sudden you shift over to Wakanda, and this is supposed to be the most technologically advanced country in the world. So it stands to reason they would be designing new things, and he would design his own things. And so it was brilliant, and I think that's the character many of us wanted to see on screen.
Okay. Wow. All right. So let's talk about the Wakanda Forever trailer. This looks like it's going to be very, very different from the first movie. And again, there are people looking in on this and saying, why are you guys, it's just a comic book movie. What's the problem? What's the big deal? What would you say to that?
Well, it's a big deal in the sense that, what I'd say, I put it this way. Black folk in general have been having a generations long war about our presence in media and what exactly that presence looks like. That's been an ongoing battle, and you could take it to any era you want. You could start with Birth of a Nation and its treatment of the black male image, most particularly, where we're presented as savage and we're presented as rapists and criminals. You could take it up through the 1970s, the sitcom era, and if you go interview those actors from the Good Times and the Jeffersons, they had battles, with white writers and producers about what black people are actually like and what should make it to the screen and what shouldn't. Matter of fact, I was just watching this morning some YouTube clips on Charles Dutton's show Rock, the sitcom Rock, in the 90s. And as brilliant as that show was, when you look behind the scenes, Charles Dutton was at war with black writers.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. He was at war with war with white writers about what Rock should do, what Baltimore was like, because he actually grew up in Baltimore. So you had white writers writing scripts for all of these black characters. Right. So he was at war. I'm saying the same thing happened with Red Fox and Sanford and Son and, all these kind of things. So this has been an ongoing multi-generational battle about bringing the reality of black life to the screen so that it resonates with people and, informs other folks who aren't black and don't live the black experience on what black people are actually dealing with versus what studios want to sell. You know what I mean? So that's been the tension. What studios want to sell and what black life is really like. That's and that's going. So it's been an ongoing thing. And in that respect, it hadn't changed. Now the visuals of Panther were striking because they actually started to bring in artists and creators, who come out of the Black experience that are changing the aesthetics of things. So you saw this beautiful African kind of aesthetic playing in to the aesthetics of the film. We'd never seen that before. But understand this, it comes out of an African American context, right? So Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are creating Panther to sell to Black American kids, right? Black American kids grow up, participate in the film industry, in the comic book industry, to make Panther more relevant. But just like most nationalists in the diaspora, when they go back to actually trying to picture what Wakanda's like, they're using different elements of African societies, but it's still based on an African American imagination about Africa. And the reason I bring that up is because that's one of the longest strains running in terms of the Black Panther character. He's African, but he's imagined through the lens of African Americanity. And this is important because African Americans don't have a direct legacy to Africa the same way others do. So if you meet someone who's Irish and they can tell you that their people come from Ireland, that's not really a question. They usually can trace their family lines. If you talk, there's an administrator in my school who's an Asian woman. She gave me the 400-year history of her family going back to Japan. Most African Americans I know get stopped up right about the grandparent, great grandparent level and couldn't tell you something beyond that. So when you start to talk about Africa, until we got all this DNA stuff very recently, most Black folk could not tell you what part of Africa their lineage hailed from. They didn't know if they were Nigerian, Ghanaian, anything else. It was a big mystery. So for African Americans, and this is the same with in the Caribbean, I would argue. This is where you get Garvey imagining going back to Africa. A lot of this is rooted in an imagination for an Africa that we didn't know. We couldn't trace our lineage to. Africa is a continent. It's not a country. It's a continent. And I would argue probably the biggest continent in the world. We're tracing ourselves to the biggest continent in the world. We don't know where we hail from. So Panther, although made by white men, is a representation of that attempt to imagine an idealized, highly technological Africa that African Americans wish for, but have no direct connection to on an emotional or experiential scale. Does that make any sense? So that's the kind of tension with it. So when you get African American creators involved, like Ryan Coogler and the people he hired to make a Wakanda a thing that we could look at on screen, it's not just, he didn't just go to Ghana and say, okay, we're going to make a Ghanaian Wakanda. That's not what he did. They pulled aesthetically from different parts of Africa based on an African-American conceptual lens, an imaginary lens about what this idealized Africa can look like. And they kind of melded all of that together. So visually, the first movie is stunning in many respects, especially for the first outing. So there's so many levels of importance when it comes to Panther that you don't get that the same way with other characters. Again, Wesley Snipes did a beautiful job with Blade, but there's no way in the world Blade is going to be an inspiration to Black women, Black men, Black boys, Black girls. It's not going to be the same. You know what I mean? He's one guy running around killing vampires. The Black Panther represents Wakanda, represents the African-American imagination about Africa, the potential of what things could have looked like for us if slavery didn't occur. The Panther becomes a symbol for so many different layers of the Black experience, the Black imaginary, as we might call it in cultural studies. There's so many layers of that tied to Black Panther simply because of how he was designed. Again, this wasn't even an immigrant from Africa who's coming over here looking for a job. This is a monarch of the most technologically advanced society in the world. Once you put it on that stage, you're tapping into a diasporan, framework that means that everybody, Black folk from South America to the Caribbean to North America, Black folk in Europe, Black folk that have been forcibly migrated around the world are now tapped into that. And they're imagining what things could be like if they had never been taken and forced into slavery, what Africa could look like, that's what Wakanda represents. It's not a literal return to an African country that we know of. It's an imaginary return to a potential idealized Africa that those in the diaspora dreamed about. That's what Marvel tapped into with this, whether they meant to or not. And I don't think they meant to. I think they meant to sell books. But what they tapped into nonetheless was a huge area of diasporic life where Black folk wished that they had a connection to an Africa that they could see on a map and physically go back to.
Okay. Okay. All right. So we're just over an hour. I think, geez, you've gone over what my last. Let's see. So the issue with the new trailer is it's just that they didn't recast T'Challa.
Yeah, that was a huge debate when Boseman passed, Chadwick Boseman passed. There was a huge debate about what to do. Now, there was some rumblings that Boseman wasn't thrilled with where they were taking the Panther story before he passed, and his brother spoke on his behalf. His biological brother spoke on his behalf by pointing that out. But there was not a lot of detail given as to what his specific issues were. We just know there was something he wasn't happy about. After he passed, they made the decision to kill off the character T'Challa, along with Chadwick Boseman, and they presented it to us as they're doing this because of how much they loved and respected Chadwick. We could understand that sentiment, but you had people like myself that were saying, no, you got to recast. T'Challa should not die with Chadwick. We can pay homage and all due respect to Chadwick, who I thought did an absolutely brilliant job as far as an actor, portraying a major character that had never been on screen before. But you don't kill off T'Challa, mainly because we've not seen that. That's not the culture of superheroes, in comics and in film. You don't kill off Clark Kent because Christopher Reeve passed away. You know what I mean? They reinvent him, as they always do. How many superhero movies have there been? How many Spider-Mans? How many Batmans? How many, there have been so many of them. So the very first time we get to see T'Challa, we got to give him up by the end of the first movie. And that's what we saw in the trailer for Wakanda Forever. He's gone. And I would argue that's probably not the most infuriating thing about the second trailer. That was one thing that a lot of us were frustrated about, that we don't get T'Challa back. And they used Chadwick as a justification for it. So it looks like you're disrespecting Chadwick if you complain about the elimination of T'Challa, which is a catch-22 that pissed a lot of us off. But I'd say the biggest issue was the removal of strong men. And if you watch the trailers, you don't see very many. You see M'Baku for a moment, but other than that, you really don't see any strong male characters. And this is particularly problematic because the legacy of comics was that it came out of a context of marketing to boys and men. So that was our own little genre. And so right around, the 1970s and 80s, you had feminists that were trying to, what they considered, gender democratized male spaces, right? Where gender could just be, kind of replaceable, irrelevant. Men and women did the same things. There's no such thing as gender roles. We can be everywhere. But they only did this with male projects. They didn't really do this. They didn't gender democratize female projects. So you don't see, you really didn't see a strong push to get boys to buy Strawberry Shortcake or Barbie or whatever. You don't see that. You didn't get a strong push to bring boys into the Girl Scouts. It was always fixated on democratizing male spaces. And so whether it was basketball or football, locker rooms, or whether it was comic books, that's what the whole push was. And it's reached, such a fever pitch that you have a lot of people that feel like the removal and downplaying of men and boys and masculinity and male culture is being attacked and made synonymous with toxicity, oppression, and evil, and really disregarding the qualities of men that have been lauded in these stories for generations. The hero's journey, which is a big part of heroic storytelling, was always about men striving to be better, to sacrifice themselves for the common good. These kind of qualities that were endemic to manhood in terms of how these stories were told. Now all of that is being associated with evil, oppression, so on and so forth. And the kind of generic idea that we see in the MCU is we're just going to replace men with women. And we're actually going to make those women better men than the men are. So if you look at the entire Avengers team right now, every major character has been replaced by a woman, whether it's been in the Disney Plus TV show or comic book or in the film. You're seeing the MCU is, especially the Avengers, is about to be all female. on one level or another. And for a legacy, that's had so much to do, with inspiring boys, that's a slap in the face.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know what the conclusion of phases 3 and 4 are going to be, but it looks very, very different.
Yeah. And they're already talking about 5 and 6. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what their sales look like, because, I mean, I'm assuming this is at least in part money driven.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's actually been one of the most backward aspects of this, because the more they push this agenda to attack, all things male, the sales tend to go down with many of these projects, and that doesn't really stem the tide of that. That's why I think Zaslav, I think his name is, who's the new head of the WB Discovery, and he's coming in, he's slashing anything that hasn't made money. He's changing I think that's going to be an archetype for what a lot of different companies are going to have to do, because I think they doubled down on these philosophies in an effort to, kind of attract new audiences from new demographics. The problem is when they do all of that virtue signaling to say, look, we're doing proper representation that includes everybody, they didn't ask people what they wanted, right? That's kind of the central problem. They're selling things to groups that have not traditionally been huge, supporters of comic books and comic book lore. And they're trying to sell them products hoping to attract their dollar. But those groups don't seem to be highly interested in this. It is what it is, and so they have to tailor their planning to the groups that are willing to spend money. And that's what they're not doing yet. And I think Zaslav represents this kind of shift in policy where at some point these large companies can no longer just ride on ideals. They have to make money. And I think that's going to end up happening in more and more areas.
Okay. My last question, if anyone wants to make a donation to the channel, my Cash App and PayPal are right there. This has been a fun talk with Dr. Johnson. I'm going to end on, I talked about Dr. Watkins a little while ago. I know he's not popular across the board. He does say some cool things sometimes. And for me, he was instrumental in keeping Dr. Claude Anderson's, bringing him out, putting his words out there. Dr. Claude Anderson talks about imaging, the need to create our own imaging. And it's one of the things I think about with this is that when other people are in control of your image, you have no control. And so you're basically at the mercy of how they want to portray you. Can you talk about how the image of Black men in media has changed over the years and what's happening to it now?
Oh my
God. Because I have all 7 seasons of Deep Space Nine back there myself.
That's right.
I saw the image of Jake in Captain Cisco. And
yes.
But what's happening? Yeah. Where have you been? Where are we going?
And I gotta say, you bring up one that's close to my heart, man. It's funny when it first came out, I actually didn't want to watch it because his name was Cisco, which was a popular drink at the time. It was a popular 40-ounce beer. So I was like, man, I don't want to watch this, man. I don't know it. And I should have. I really wish I watched it earlier, but I didn't start watching it until I had my son. And not long after that, I became a widower. So when I started watching it, I'm really experiencing this as Jake Cisco. I mean, as Captain Cisco, because he's a widower. He's raising a son by himself. I'm doing the same, watching him do it. And the stories were just absolutely brilliant. So I'm a huge Deep Space Nine fan. But I think Deep Space Nine, just like, A Man Called Hawk, which was another character that was played by, what's the actor? I'm blanking on his name. Avery Brooks. Avery Brooks plays Captain Cisco. He played A Man Called Hawk, which was a spinoff of Spencer for Hire in the late 80s, early 90s. You had moments like that where you had strong, intelligent acting with good storytelling that would pop up. But again, the same tensions I mentioned before. Is this marketable to the mainstream would be the biggest, kind of opposition to that type of television. So you know, and Deep Space Nine was actually a huge success in that they were able to keep mainstream attention for several years and a number of seasons, and still bring in relevant stories that dealt with the Black experience. Usually, you get a much shorter runtime than that. So you know that's been that ongoing battle back and forth for generations, and so I think one of the tensions you get is the kind of Good Times, Family Matters kind of dynamic where one's character appeals to the mainstream, who's kind of a buffoon, who trivializes the experience. He's the comedic humor, you know, the you know, that whole dynamic. And yet, for many of the Black actors and folks who appreciate what the series has done, it kind of gets whittled down to that one character making an offhand joke. And that's, you know, and so that happened with Good Times, happened with Family Matters. We could say it happened with a lot of different series. And you know, and that's the tension. You know, what I see happening now, I think that there's a movement for independent products because it's gotten a lot cheaper to make films, to make television shows. I mean, you literally see people can make films using their smartphones at this point. And a lot of the editing and you know the kind of equipment that goes along with, you know, making media is so much more accessible than it was 50 years ago. You can literally buy a program or download one onto your computer, and you can teach yourself how to use it watching YouTube videos and literally apply it to your own projects. I mean, hell, when YouTube was started, I remember one of the things that I was so blown away about when I started my YouTube account. They called it a channel. I was like, we have channels. I'm an 80s kid. I grew up off of television. A channel was something that was on the box. You turn the dial to watch channel 7, channel 4, you know. But now all of a sudden we had channels. And this, and you know, and you know, the younger generation after us, they could touch the media in ways we couldn't. You know what I mean? They could stop, they could rewind, they could record, they could, you know, they could do all kinds of things with media my generation couldn't. I mean, there's still a G.I. Joe special that I ain't seen the end of because I had to go to the bathroom when it played, and I never caught it after that. You know what I mean? That's what used to happen. If you missed it, you missed it. The next generations had a very different relationship to media. So what I see now is independent projects that are being made. They don't have to cost as much as they used to. You can have access to equipment that used to be, you know, inaccessible to the everyday public. The problem I think Black creators have is the problem we've always had: distribution and so forth. You can make independent projects, just like many of us do as content creators on YouTube, and you create your own audience, but that's still very different from, you know, getting kind of global representation with a lot of resources. And that's kind of what we're up against. You know, we still don't have a significant number of TV channels, let alone film companies. And the companies we do have are under big names like Tyler Perry, so they're still filtered through very few avenues. And so it's really a matter of using these independent spaces to create content that you want to see happen, and building your own support base to support you in getting that out. And I think there's a lot more potential to do that now than say 50, 60 years ago. So the characters that I think can come about from that can be quite profound. I mean, even on YouTube, we're seeing comic book creators like Eric July and the Rippaverse, who've gotten over $3 million in funding directly from the people, rather than waiting for Marvel or DC to approve. I mean, you know, Milestone was kind of one of the best we got out of that dynamic, where DC kind of gave them space under the DC umbrella to do some things. But you know, you still couldn't just write Icon beating the snot out of Superman. You had to kind of negotiate in certain ways. And but even that was a development in the early 90s, because prior to that, the only thing I saw was Muhammad Ali kick the crap out of Superman. And that was because the Nation of Islam had to negotiate with DC. Muhammad Ali was such a huge figure in the 1970s. That's how that had to come about. But short of that, if you didn't have that kind of power and backing to negotiate with these companies, many Black characters were relegated to the sidelines. So, you know, we're seeing an evolution of those battles, but it comes in cycles. It takes a great deal of time. There's a lot of potential for it, but it comes down to what we're willing to create and support.
Okay. All right. Dr. Johnson, yeah, we're almost at an hour and a half. I'm going to wrap up. I appreciate you coming and giving your insights on this. Do you have any parting comments?
Well,
did we miss anything?
I need you to teach me how to get that Snow White beard. I need to get that going. You know, I want that seasoned look right there. No, but no, I just appreciate you having me on, man. I'm glad that we could have this conversation.
Okay, well, enjoy your black while you have it. Afterwards, you have to dye it.
I don't want patches of white. I want that smooth thing you got. You know, that's what I want.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. Yeah. Well, everyone, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up. I think the movie comes out in November. The Wakanda Forever. Yeah, I'll probably go see it. I mean, I might not be there jam packed with everybody on the first night, but I'll probably go see it just to, or maybe I'll wait for the reviews first. I don't know.
Well, I'm in a position where people, ask me to see it and then tell them what I think, what I think about it. So it often means you got to watch a bunch of stuff that, turns your stomach. Every now and again, you get a jewel, but a lot of the time you got to watch a lot of crap when you're doing that kind of work to, kind of explain this stuff. So we'll see how it is.
Okay. Well, everyone, I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank everyone who you brought a crowd with you. This is the biggest turnout I've had on this channel. I talk about media stuff over here, past movies, characters, current movies, books, those kinds of things. So it jumps around a bit over here. And I'm also working on my own book project. I'll show this really quickly. I should have it queued up already, but I don't. It's called The Engineers, a Western New York basketball story. It's my story and some other guys' story from Western New York. It's about what sports teach you at an early age, whether or not you go pro or play at one of the major Division I levels. So I'm working on editing this now. The link is right here. Oh, no, that's the StreamYard link. I have numerous promotional essays and videos for this right now. It's a lengthy page. There's a description there at the top. There's me on Inauguration Day. Everyone else was around the TV. I was out in the woods taking pictures. That's Delaware Park in Buffalo. I'm just going to go through this quickly. All the promotional pieces are down here. There are videos, and there are pieces in print as well. So if you have some time and want to go poke around, well, please go take a look. Let me know if you think it looks good, if it looks interesting, or if you think it looks like crap. Whatever. There's a comment section at the bottom. You can leave a comment. Please leave a comment. Please take a look. And also, I've started the Big Words LLC Newsletter. So feel free. Well, yeah, this captures my content also as a writer and as a YouTuber. So this is below in the description box as well. There's a 2-paragraph reading, and then there's a subscription button at the bottom. So for anyone who is interested, and the link is here, but it's also down in the description box. And with that, yeah, we'll wrap up. Everyone, thank you for watching. If you're new, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're watching on the playback and you want to make a donation, my Cash App and PayPal are below in the description box. Everyone, stay safe out there. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And as always, remember that your attitude determines your altitude. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.